As we finish up this series, we're going to move into working with frameworks, which I spoke of a little bit ago in my organizational techniques video tutorial. The framework of my choice is called 960 grid system. So I'm going to show you the beginnings of how to get started working with a framework like this in your own projects. The first step, of course, is to download the templates. So let's go ahead and give that just a moment. I'm going to save that. And here's our files created by Nathan Smith. And he's going to offer you a handful of things when you download this. It's all free of charge. But you can see we have a fireworks extension. I'm not going to use that. You have templates, and this is really helpful when you're designing new sites. So you can see here, if we're working on a 12-column grid, you can import this into your Photoshop file, and you can begin designing your site so that it fits this grid specifically. Very helpful. Another one would be, let's see, what else you need to take a look at. The licensing, of course, take a look at that. And then you need the code. And here's the main area that we need to work with. So they have some demos, and you're free to take a look at that, but all I'm interested in right now is the CSS files. So for this example, I'm going to download the uncompressed. And now you have an option when you're working with 960s, whether you want to work with a 12-column grid, the recently added 24-column grid, or the 16-column. I've noticed for my projects, 12 will do, but you might want to upgrade depending on how complex yours is. We'll stick with 12 for this case, so I can get rid of everything. I'm going to get 960, the reset file, and the text. These two are simply helper style sheets. The text just has a little bit to get you started with your typography. All that's required here is 960.css, but we can go ahead and grab this if we want. We'll grab 960 and that one. So I'm going to go into our project files, and I can delete a lot of these from previous lessons. And let's go ahead and bring these in. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder called CSS, and we'll drag in our core style sheet, and we'll also drag in this second one as well. There we go. So now let's go into TextMate. And if we open up our CSS file, let's go ahead and update this right here. And we'll do one more. So we need to grab 960 first, but reset should actually be implemented first. And then next, we're going to grab 960.css. So now that we've imported these files, we can use the classes that are available to us. If I open up 960 Framework, you can see that the way you create your websites is by applying classes. So you see here we have container 12 and container 16. The 960 grid framework is based on a 960 pixel width. So if you're working with a different size, you might want to use something else. But 960 has been considered to be the perfect width, especially for users as low as a 1024 resolution. So, and then you have all these different grids, and I'm going to show you how to work with them. All right, so we're going to create a div with an ID of container. Okay. So we want to apply a class to let 960 know what width, which kind of grid are we working with, a 12 column or a 16. I want to work with a 12 column. So we can bring that, come on back, and provide a class of that. So if we go into our style sheet now, let's go ahead and do container. And I'm just going to set a background of red just so we can see what we're working with. And a height, because there's nothing by default, of 500 pixels. When I'm working on my project, I of course go ahead and remove that. So let's go ahead and open desktop with the Ninja. There we go. So when we apply this column, just to remind you, if I go ahead and remove that, that's what we end up with. So it sets a width of 960 pixels. It sets the margin left and right to auto, and you can see everything it does here. All right. So now we can begin working with this. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this right here. And within here, let's say we're going to start with a header. So we'll do div header, and this is my header. And you know what you would want to do if you're working with HTML5 is go ahead and wrap this within a header class. Now, if you want to take advantage of this, it will require JavaScript for an Internet Explorer, which is why I'm not going to worry about that too much. And you see how that disappears right there. Let's go ahead and give it an ID of header if you want. But I don't want to get into the browser issues with using the HTML5 elements in this series. We might do a HTML5 series later, so we'll stick with just a simple div. That'll do just fine. Okay, so do we want our header to take up the entire width? Let's go ahead and add that background back on. And I'm going to say yes. So the way I can do that is I said div id equals header, class is grid 12. And that means the grid needs to take up the entire width. If I go back to my style sheet and I set a background, whoops, let's go to header. And I set a background of green just for the example. Now you can see that setting up a grid does more than just centering it. It applies some margins. So let's go ahead and find out what this grid 12 does. So grid 12, it sets a display inline, and this is actually to fix some issues with Internet Explorer 6. So 960 can also ease up your IE6 issues. When you float an element in Internet Explorer, it's generally a good practice to also set the display to inline. And then it applies a margin left and a margin right of 10 pixels, which is where that's represented. So now let's say we want to have our main content area, and it's going to be split into, I don't know, 3 columns, right? So we'll do div id equals main. And within here, I don't have a specific name for it. Why don't we just call it call1? But why don't we give it a class now? And if we know we want 3 columns, that would be 12, because that's the grid we're working with, divided by 3 equals 4. So we know that each class needs to be grid underscore 4. If we wanted 4 columns, that would be 12 divided by 4 is 3, and we would do 3 columns. Okay, so let's stick with 3 columns here, and we'll just write call1. And you know what, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the ID because it's not necessarily here. Necessary. So let's copy that. And you can see that's separated into 3 columns simply by applying a grid. So let's go back, and if we want to do grid 3, or was it 4? It was 4. Give it a background, white. And now you can see how that's laid out. So let's go back and make this a little bit more real world. Why don't we add some Lorem text here? There you go, and that's totally in the wrong program. We can copy that just so we have a little bit of an actual data to work with. Refresh the page, and there you go. So now we have our header. This would obviously be filled with your logo and any kind of headings. Then you can have your main content. I can go ahead and remove this height because that's not necessary. There you go. If we want to do another layer, so let's go ahead and add something more. Let's do in main. We can go ahead and do another one, and this will be div class equals grid. And let's do 2 columns, so we'll do grid 6. Okay, I'm just going to grab this paragraph again. So now we know this will take up, as 12 divided by 6 is 2, it'll take up 50%. And you might want to apply some margin. So we could do id equals, I don't know, subcontent or whatever you want to call that. And you could come back here, subcontent, margin top, 20 pixels, whatever you want to do there. Okay. If we want to add another one, let's go ahead and do that right now. And now that'll take up the next side. So let's say we said grid 7. That would then be equal to 13, and it's going to be too much to fit on that line. So, as you can see here, there we go, it'll have to fall onto its own line. So keep that in mind. You want to make sure these add up to 12. But this really allows you a lot of flexibility, not to mention that this is going to work in all browsers. You don't have to worry about any float issues in IE. It works really well. If we want to go back and add our footer, we can do that. We could use HTML5 footer element. I encourage you to look into that. But not for this series. My footer. And let's go ahead and style it really quickly. Obviously, we're not going for some great design here. So, what are you getting here? Why is it all blue? And the reason is because you're floating all of these elements. So if you remember back to when we were talking about when you float elements, it causes the parent element to collapse. The footer is a great place to make sure it clears any floated elements that are above it. As you can see there. And now it's all the way down. If you later decide, you know what, why don't we split the footer, you know, those fancy footers that maybe you see on NetTuts where it has 5 columns at the bottom. You could do that. Why don't we separate this if we wanted to do 12 divided by 6 is 2. We could do that. Why don't we do 4 columns? That's pretty common. So class equals, whoops, we'll need to create more divs within here. You could even use the section element. That's an HTML5 element if you're only going to be using links. So maybe about us, and then another one's going to be popular posts, and another one's going to be featured posts or whatever. In that case, you could use the HTML5 nav element. That would be okay. Once again, for this case, we're not going to do that. We're going to give the class a grid3, and that'll make sure that it'll only take up 25%, or 12 divided by 3 is 4, 1/4, 25%. So we can do that. Call 1, copy that, 2, 3, 4. And let's go ahead and make sure we style these. So I can say footer, grid3. And I'm just going to set a background of green, just going with our terrible color scheme. And now we have the 4 columns for the footer. So if I get rid of red, okay, so you have the beginnings. Obviously that doesn't look that great, but you can then improve and make it adapt to any of your designs. And this is a really, really nice way to, especially if you're creating something like a magazine layout, something like a CNN types layout. If you want to take a look at my website, I'm not really much of a designer, to be honest, but I'm using the 960 framework for mine, and you can immediately see. So what we have here is, this is a 12 column grid. So this featured post area takes up half, so that would be grid 6. And then for the second section, we would have, I can't remember exactly what we have here, maybe grid 4 and grid 2, or grid 3, I'm not sure, grid 4, 6, 10, and grid 2 possibly. I can't remember exactly, but this is all done with the grid, and it gives you a very nice and clean layout. So that has been your introduction to the Grid 960 framework. You can do a little bit more. There's a lot of classes available to you, and I encourage you to dig deeper and learn more about this.